Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to be presenting today on the first chapter of my dissertation in skim, rough outline, I guess you could say. I've entitled this chapter, and Miss Robin, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sure I'm going to be wrong. A Stringere affair and love story. A
Why
str-
would that be wrong?
well, Stringere is, of course, a Latin word that means something to the effect of constriction, stricture, etc. Right, and I don't know how to pronounce it. That's what I meant. And
Probably my Latin is not
Mhm.
as good as my Italian, so maybe John would know better. But in Italian, it would be pronounced stringere.
Stringere.
But we could find that out pretty easily. So I'll try to find that out before the end of your presentation.
Listen, to you do so much for me, Miss Robin. But in the opening sentences of Darwin's final chapter, his ultimate chapter in The Origin of Species, he famously wrote this whole volume, that being the origin of the species, or on the origin of the species for the more full title, is one long argument. Stephen Jay Gould's book entitled The Structure of Evolutionary Theory, similarly, on the structure of evolutionary theory, hence the name, is also a brief for an explicit interpretation that may be portrayed as a single extended argument. Although Gould thinks that our best current formulation of evolutionary theory includes modes of reasoning rather, and a set of mechanisms substantially at variance or at odds, you could say, with strict Darwinian natural selection, the logical structure of Darwinian thought remains remarkably intact. As a primary theme for this one log argument of Gould's, he claims that there is an essence. Say it with me. Essence. Say it
Essence.
with me again. Essence. Right? And I mean, really, that you would not expect such coming from a modern philosopher of biology, but nonetheless, he uses the term essence there. He thinks that there is an essence of Darwinian logic that can be defined by specifying a set of minimal commitments or broad statements so essential to the central logic of the whole enterprise that disproof of any one item will effectively destroy the theory, whereas a substantial change to any one item will convert the theory into something still recognizable within the ball plan of descent from its forebear, but is something sufficiently different to identify. Under this premise, the long argument of the structure of evolutionary theory, which I'm going to, well, no, I probably stutter on that too much, but the structure of, I'm just going to call it the structure. Yeah, the structure. Under that premise, the long argument of Gould's structure then proceeds according to three sequential claims that set the basic structure and order of the book. First, Darwin himself formulated his central argument under three basic premises, what Gould calls agency, efficacy, and scope, which all three refer to Darwin's formulation, the overproduction of offspring, variation by some manner, and heritability in some manner of that variation, respectively. That's Darwin's words, and of course, Gould interprets that as agency, efficacy, and scope. Second key sequential claim that sets the order of the structure of evolutionary theory is that as macroevolutionary theory experienced its growing pains and pursued its founding arguments in the late 19th and early 20th century, these three principles of central logic defined the themes of the most central, pertinent, persistent, and pointed debate. Thirdly, the third large claim of structure of evolutionary theory. As the structure of Darwinism, however, particularly of the modern synthesis, prevailed and hardened, something I'll get back to later, which culminated in the overconfidence of the centennial celebrations of 1959. Of course, there was also a 1909 celebration to remember Darwin's birth. That was a large. That was yeah. That was a very large gathering in 1909, and then the centennial of the Origin of Species meeting occurred in 1959. Those are two key meetings that we need to keep in mind as we go through this. Nevertheless, again, it culminated in the meeting of 1959. A new wave of discoveries and theoretical reformulations began to challenge aspects of the three central principles anew, thus leading to another fascinating round of development in macroevolutionary theory, extending through the last 2 to 3 decades of the 20th century and on now into the 21st. Hugh Falconer, a Scottish surgeon, paleontologist, and tea grower of Darwin's contemporary times, once said of Darwin, and I quote, "Darwin has, beyond all his contemporaries," by which I think he means contemporaries, but maybe that's what he scribbled, so to speak, and then but the people couldn't read his handwriting, but nevertheless, in the text that I'm reading, which is the authoritative text of the letters of Charles Darwin, it's contemporaries, but nevertheless, Darwin has, beyond all his contemporaries, given an impulse to the philosophical investigation of the most backward and obscure branch of the biological sciences of his day. He has laid the foundations of a great edifice, but he need not be surprised if, in the progress of its erection, the superstructure is altered rather by successors, like the Duomo of Milan, from Roman to different style architecture. That brings up an interesting point here, and I think I sort of abbreviate the discussion of this, and I want to point out something here before we go any further. The Duomo, the Duomo of Milan,
Duomo.
Duomo,
Yeah.
excuse me. The Duomo of Milan has an interesting history. The thing's been around for millennia now, essentially, if I remember correctly, and
Well, I mean,
it
that's where Augustine is is.
yeah.
I don't know if it's true that he was buried there, but I was there not that long ago, and you can see a, the place where he was baptized under the
Really, that's
foundations.
awesome.
So
Awesome.
millennia in
Yeah,
that sense. So go ahead.
really, in that sense, is about right. Then I mean, it's what
Mhm,
17, 1800 years they're about, but or 1600 years, whatever. But
mhm.
regardless, all throughout its life span, if you will, that being the structure, it's undergone several very important changes in the superstructure, not the foundation. I mean, if I had a better memory, I could recount. You know that they've added on, they've taken away, they've rearranged, they have expanded on the same foundation. In so much as Duomo of Milan is quite an unstable, I guess, structure today because it's been built upon so many times, it's expanded, but it's because it still has that same foundation that it was built upon. Gould employs this imagery
Hmm.
Gould employs this imagery to note how evolutionary theory, broadly conceived Darwinian evolutionary theory, more specifically, might still have the same foundation that it had in 1859, although the superstructure of it has been greatly modified since then, added to, subtracted from, modified, etc. So that's an illuminative metaphor that he uses throughout his structure of evolutionary theory, that is. Indeed, in a letter to Falconer on October 1st, 1862, Darwin explicitly addressed this passage in Falconer's text. Darwin notes, To return to your concluding sentence, far from being surprised, I look at it as absolutely certain that very much in the origin will be proved rubbish, but I expect and hope that the framework will stand. This title, Gould's Structure, seeks to demonstrate just that idea. That is, that late modernity must transform Darwinian thought, but that it will retain a Darwinian look and feel about it, however minutely. Stephen Jay Gould's view is closer to Falconer than to Darwin, but in accord with Darwin on one key point, which led him to write the structure, while also supplying the organizing principle for its one long argument. Gould believes that the Darwinian framework persists in the emerging structure of a more adequate evolutionary theory. He also holds with Falconer that substantial changes introduced during the last half of the 20th century had built a structure so expanded beyond the original Darwinian core and so enlarged by new principles of macroevolutionary explanation that the full exposition, while remaining within the domain of Darwinian logic, must be construed as basically different from the canonical theory of natural selection as developed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, instead of being simply extended. The central thesis of the structure can be stated positively and succinctly. Much of the evolutionary significant portion of variation is discontinuous and mechanically built by intrinsic construction. The primary cause of evolution, a process that also tends to be discontinuous, must therefore be located in the rules, the patterns, and the direction of change. The overarching question that Gould pursues in this structured text is whether Darwinism or Darwinian theory can be treated as an entity with defining properties of anatomical form that permit us to specify a beginning, and most crucially, for the analysis that Gould wishes to pursue, to judge the subsequent history of Darwinism with enough rigor to evaluate successes, to evaluate failures, and especially to evaluate the degree and character of alterations. Gould's The Structure asserts then, as its key premise in one large argument, that the central core of Darwinian logic needs to remain sufficiently intact to maintain continuity as the centerpiece of the entire field, but should proceed with enough important changes to all of the major branches extended from this core to alter the structure of evolutionary theory into something truly different by expansion, addition, and redefinition. In short, according to Gould, the structure of evolutionary theory combines enough stability for coherence with enough change to keep anyone in a perpetual mode of search and challenge. Most so-called explanations in evolutionary theory amount to little more than just so stories. And you'll note that I've highlighted a few things here and there. That's because I need to go back and fill out the references and so forth, right? So if you run into something that's highlighted, that's what it means in this text. Very well.
Very well.
Yes, just so stories, of course, was originated by Rudyard Kipling, rather, I should say.
Yep.
Right, and it simply refers to plausible claims made without verified evidence, whereas other prominent trends could not even generate a plausible story in adaptationist terms at all. That's what they assert. For Gould, the case for an external and objective coherence of his alternative view of evolution is even stronger because he gathered the independent items in ignorance of their coordination over a 25-year period of time. And this is the magnum opus in which he presents his life's work, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory, one of the best books of all time, pure joy to read as well. For Gould, or rather, I should say, Gould realizes that his structure will be revolutionary, or at least be revolutionary in its entailments. However, it's notable to remark, or it's notable to make mention of the fact that he wrote these separate pieces that are now collected in the structure of evolutionary theory, while he pretty much still affirmed a strict neo-Darwinian evolution. That is a conventional view. Although the directing of evolutionary change by forces other than the natural selection has loosely been described as constraint, the term, even while acknowledged as a domain for exceptions to Darwinian standard mechanisms, has almost always been conceived of as a negative force or phenomenon, that is a mode of preventing, through lack of variation, for example, a population's attainment of greater adaptation. But constraint in science, and even in really the vernacular English as well, also has strongly positive meanings in two quite different senses. First, empirically, as channeled directionality for reasons of past history, which could be conserved as homology or, or by physical principles. And second, conceptually, as a non-standard force, therefore interesting ipso facto, acting differently than from what Darwinian orthodoxy might predict. Indeed, the meanings and derivations of constraint are varied and complex. The Latin root stringere, yeah, means both to compress or to draw tight, that being the negative connotations. But it also means to move, to affect, or to touch, which are the positive aspects. The prefix con, meaning with or together, brings entities into a field of change or compression. Thus, constraints can surely be negative, as when I, a miscreant, spent several years, several months in prison with other miscreants, constrained so that we might be near each other and not get away, right? But it can also be positive. It can mean as when we force a group of items into closer conjunction so that their combined power might be more than the force alone. Think of brake lines in your car, right? Notice your brake lines are usually, what, 3/16 of an inch? Why do they do that? They do that to increase the pressure of the brake fluid, right? Also, Bernoulli's principle in physics. Of course, if you ran liquid through a hole or through a pipe this big, it wouldn't have as much pressure. But if you ran liquid through a hole this big, it'd have more pressure, right? Follow me? Good deal. So constraints can also be positive, as particularly highlighted in the increased speed of fluids, as I mentioned earlier, according to Bernoulli's principle. While English itself seemingly favors the negative connotations, the positive meanings remain current and certainly sanctioned, both historically and linguistically. Positive meanings of constraint can lead to important extensions of evolutionary theory by questioning and reformulating the functionalist attribution of effectively all substantial evolutionary change to natural selection. Again, positive aspects of constraint can change our focus from a strict Darwinian natural selection view to a more expanded view. The theoretically radical version of structural constraint in historicist evolution posits an important role for an additional phenomenon, macroevolution, the truly non-adaptive origin of structures that may be that is, using something originally made for something else in a new manner, you could say, right? Indeed. Like, like for example, if our appendix all of a sudden became able to digest food, having the appendix is mostly worthless in most modern mammals. Of course, it does nothing, right? But let's say it gained a new function, and that would be an exaptation, if you will. Also, many sources of such non-adaptive origin may be specified, but invariable architectural consequences of other creatures, of other features, I should say. The Spandrels of Gould and Lewontin's terminology, 1979. Of course, Gould and Lewontin in 79 made reference to the Spandrels of San Marco, right? And that referenced a famous Catholic church or Catholic meeting place. Catholic Catholic Church would be the best way. I think in somewhere in Italy, but regardless, they noted that the spandrels. That's an architectural term that refers to whenever domes come to meet and they leave triangular formations behind them when domes meet together. Well, see these spandrels at San Marco, they look nice, what have you, but they've got paintings on them that are remarkable now today, written painted in 1300s CE. Nevertheless, they're still magisterial in their orientation. Those paintings, if you were to walk into a church, say at San Marco, you'd look up at the dome ceiling, you see those paintings, and you might automatically think that those paintings there on those triangular spaces within the domes, the pendentives as they call them architecturally, were meant to be there. But in fact, you'd be wrong, because all it is simply the the church body taking advantage of a structural artifact. Similarly, similarly, spandrels are structural artifacts. Indeed, they are. They probably rank as most frequent and most important in the history of lineages. That is, spandrels. Gould affirms the importance and high relative frequency of spandrels, and therefore the non-adaptive origin of many characteristics in evolutionary entities within evolutionary theory by a major argument of their sheer ubiquity. This class of non-adaptive origins challenges the dominant role of of an Alfred Russel Wallacean, so to speak, if you will. His name is Wallace, but if you conjugate it, Wallacean adaptationism in evolutionary theory. Darwin Darwin focused very heavily upon, as an aside here, very heavily upon his notion of selection, natural selection. But those who came after him put even more emphasis upon natural selection than Darwin did, to where it became pan-adaptationism. That is, all adaptationism, right? Essentially, Darwin's theory, in strong and revolutionary contrast to former evolutionary thinking, presents the first fully and truly externalist account of evolution, in which contingent change, that is, the summation of unpredictable local adaptations rather than deterministic unfolding of inherent potential under internal biological principles, proceeds by an interaction between organic raw material, which is the undirected variation part, and environmental guidance, that is, natural selection. Darwin overturned all previous traditions by thus granting the external environment a cause and, in fact, a controlling role in the direction of evolutionary change, with the environment construed as the ensemble of biotic and abiotic factors external to the organism, however intrinsically locked unto, or even largely defined by, the presence of the organism itself. Adaptational results flow, then, logically from the mechanisms defining all of the sub-branches on the limb of Darwinism designated by Gould as the creativity of natural selection. He's got the Wiktionary. He's got the Wiktionary. Wiktionary. Yeah, from Robin. Gotcha. Adaptational results flow then logically from the mechanisms defining all other sub-branches on the limb of Darwinism designated by Gould as the creativity of natural selection. If the uniqueness and revolutionary character of Darwinism inheres largely in the formulation of natural selection as a theory of interaction between biological insides and their environmental outsides, and not as a theory of evolutio, which means, by the way, intrinsic unfolding, then the outsides must receive explicit discussion, a need best fulfilled within Darwin's case for the full extrapolation of natural selection. Under internalist theories of evolution, however, environment at most holds power to derail the process by not behaving properly, not by directing, in a sense, in an orchestra. Darwin placed a lot of emphasis upon the environment. It doesn't cause mutations or so forth, or variation as he referred to it, but it does shape variation and exploits it. Gould largely argues that internalism poses two separate challenges to pure Darwinian functionalism. First, saltational change arising from internal forces of mutability, and second, inherent directionality of variation, corresponding to the facet flipping and channeling on Galton's polyhedron, which will be discussed later in this paper, actually, and in this dissertation. Most internalists or structuralists or formalists, those all synonymous with each other, emphasize the second theme of channels and preferred directionality of variation, now expressed in the popularity of constraints as a subject in modern evolutionary theory. This style of internalism predominates also throughout history. Fewer internalists emphasize the saltational theme, and those who do, like William Bateson, tend to support channeling as well as facet flipping in the sense of Galton's polyhedron that we're going to get back to later. In contrast, under Darwinian functionalism, environment becomes an active partner in both the modes and directions of evolutionary change. The central logic of Darwinism is based upon two essential biological principles or postulates of natural selection: its operation at the organismal level and its creativity in crafting adaptations. The evolutionary epic or play, and I don't mean epic there in the sense of something already with an outcome defined. I'm rather using it as a meandering story that seemingly has no end until it gets there, if that makes sense to you. Right. But the evolutionary epic, the evolutionary epic or play can proceed with such a minimal cast, but we do not know whether the drama can actually unfold on our planet until we examine and specify the character of the proverbial theater, that is, the geological and environmental stage upon which the play of natural selection is run. Adaptation is the answer to the problem of transforming external environmental information into eternal changes of form, physiology, and behavior. But Darwin at all times grants natural selection the most fundamental and critical role by virtue of its relative frequency. It is, in his words, by far the predominant power. It's interesting here that Darwin, in his notebooks, wrote power with a capital P. He's personifying the power of natural selection. He's personifying natural selection itself. Elsewhere, he writes, over all other causes of change, I'm convinced that natural selection is paramount. The best strategy for finding the source of change in populations, Darwin asserts, lies in the study of adaptation. For adaptation is the direct and primary result of natural selection. And the relative frequency of selection stands so high that almost any adaptation will record its forming power. Adaptation, therefore, becomes, for Darwin, the primary subject for practical study of evolutionary entities and mechanisms. Darwin, Gould asserts, names adaptation as both the common and coordinating result of nearly any episode of non-trivial evolutionary change. So then, adaptation not only pervades nature with overwhelming relative frequency, but it also embodies the immediate action of the primary cause of change, to which applies natural selection. Thus, an evolutionary biologist, or even a paleontologist, first approach to any problem regarding change in evolutionary entities must pose the question, what adaptive value can we assign to this feature or adaptation? How did natural selection work in this instance? In promoting the all-mot of natural selection, Darwin rolls all exceptions, all if, ands, and buts, and maybes into subsidiaries of adaptation forged by natural selection, meaning that the reality of the situation is either a consequence of adaptation or inherited marks of previous adaptations. Note what I mean by that. Darwin rolls everything into pure functionalism, and as a result, anything that may seem to be inherent structure of nature gets simply explained away as being either the consequence of an adaptation or the consequence of a previous adaptation before the ones we've got now, if that makes sense. Indeed, in Darwin's argument about the creative potential of natural selection, he expects us to buy into an entire conceptual world, a world where externalities, that is, environments, direct and construct evolutionary entities, and internalities supply only raw material but impose no serious constraint upon or challenge to change. This is a world where the functional stimulus for change comes first and the structural alteration of form only follows. So in a strict Darwinian system, a strict Darwinian functionalism, the change comes first and then internalities, if you will follow. So again, the change comes first and then the form follows. The all-mot creativity of natural selection makes adaptation the central principle, isotropy of variation necessary to it, and gradualism pervasive within it. Yes. Gould avers that the key questions in the 21st century, in the 21st century, regarding biology and evolution, particularly macroevolution, include at least the following. Shall we accept Darwin's triumphalist stance and hold that the framework remains basically intact, fixed, that is, with all visually substantial change analogous to the non-structural and and literally superficial icing of pinnacles? Or shall we embrace a different model like Falconer's, more rich and more critical one, but still fully positive concept of structure that has changed in radical ways by incorporating entirely different styles into crucial parts of the building, while still managing to integrate all the differences into a coherent and functional whole, encompassing more and more territory in this continuing environment, this continuing enlargement, I should say. Getting broken up all the time today. Excuse me. After all, for Gould, the distinction between Falconer's and Darwin's predictions, a key ingredient in my analysis in the dissertation, rests upon the ability of one to define the central features of Darwinism, that is, automorphies, as Gould calls them, so that we may then be able to discern whether the extent of alteration and our modern understanding of evolutionary mechanisms and causes remains within the central logic of his Darwinian formulations, or has now changed so profoundly that, by any fair criterion in vernacular understandings of language, or by any formal account of departure from original premises, our current explanatory theory must be described as a different kind of mental thing. So again, in essence of that paragraph there, Gould is asking us, have these changes and alterations to Darwin's theory transformed it in such a way that we have to abandon the theory altogether and change its name, or is it merely cuts, so to speak? And I'll get into that later too. Gould attempts to construct an essence of macroevolutionary theory within this title. According to Gould, indeed, theories have essences, but so do organisms in a more restrictive and nuanced sense. For example, in their limitation and challenging, or in their limitation and channeling by constraints of structure and history, expressed as the ball plan of higher taxa. Moreover, Gould's partial defense of organic essences, expressed as support for structuralist versions of evolutionary causality, in conjunction with the more conventional Darwinian functionalism, also underlies the double entendre of the structures of evolutionary theory's title, which honors the intellectual structure of evolutionary theory within Darwinian traditions and their alternatives, and which also urges support for a limited version of structuralist theory in opposition to certain strict Darwinian varieties. The massive switch from archetype to ancestor in macroevolutionary theory permitted one to reformulate the idea of essence as a broad and fruitful basket of commonalities, essentially, that unite a set of particulars into the most meaningful relationships of common causal structure and genesis. The active use of the good word essence, Gould strongly asserts, should not be hampered by a shyness due to battles won so long ago that no one can hardly even remember the original reasons for its anathemization in the first place. That is the term essence. Let's skip over that part. It is part of Gould's goals for the structure of evolutionary theory to formulate an expanded, explicitly macroevolutionary theory that introduces substantial revisions on each branch of Darwinian central logic, but builds in its ensemble a coherently enlarged structure with a retained Darwinian core, moving from Darwin's single level of agency of hierarchical theory, moving from Darwin's single level agency of organismal natural selection to a hierarchical theory of selection on the first branch, balancing positive sources of internal constraint with conventional externalism of natural selection on the second branch, and recognizing the disparate inputs of various tiers of time, rather than trying to explain all phylogenetic mechanics by uniformitarian extrapolation from microevolutionary process on the third branch. For the 1909 Darwinian Centennial, Vernon L. Kellogg produced a classic exposition of Darwin's theory, I should say, broadly defined as Darwinism today. A volume providing a fair hearing for all varieties of Darwinism in all alternative and auxiliary views in a decade of maximal dissent to and diversity in evolutionary theories. Kellogg's book adopts the same premises as Gould's The Structure of Evolutionary Theory. That is, Darwinism embodies a meaningful central logic or essence, and that other proposals about evolutionary mechanisms can be classified with reference to their consonance or dissonance with these three basic Darwinian commitments. Kellogg's categories, though differently named and parsed from Gould's, are essentially identical with those that Gould recognizes. Kellogg divides the plethora of diversity in then current Darwinian proposals into those that are auxiliary to and those that are alternative to Darwin's theory of natural selection. Notably, Kellogg recognized hierarchy as an auxiliary, not a confutation, to Darwinism, and it is noteworthy that this same contention sets a principal theme of Gould's The Structure of Evolutionary Theory. In his second category of confutations, Kellogg identified three general theories or groups of theories which are offered more as alternative and substitutionary theories for natural selection than as auxiliary or supporting theories. One, as functionalist as Darwinism, but offering a different explanation for adaptation, is known as Lamarckism, which refers colloquially to the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And then he offers two structuralist alternatives that deny that adaptation must guide the origin of new species: orthogenesis and heterogenesis, which the latter of which is Kellogg's designation for saltationism. Orthogenesis is an interesting phenomenon, but I'm probably not going to get into it today, perhaps later. But I will make brief reference to heterogenesis as Kellogg terms it, or saltational change. The then current state of evolutionary theory in and around 1900 CE required restriction or constriction for further advancement, either settling upon one of four contenders, Darwinism plus the three challenges mentioned above, or a new formulation altogether. The first phase of the synthesis of the modern synthesis, that is, accomplished this settling of ideas in three major moves: by choosing the Darwinian central core as proper and fundamental in theory. Secondly, by reading Mendelism in a different way to validate rather than confute the central core. And thirdly, by utilizing this fusion to ban the three alternatives of Lamarckism, saltation, and orthogenesis. Kellogg clearly stated that the logic of all three alternatives stands squarely against natural selection if we argue for prevailing strength of effect and relative frequency. All of these theories, writes Kellogg, offer distinctly substitutional methods of species forming. However, Kellogg showed no particular sensitivity to the nuances, shadings, and subtleties that arguments about relative frequency always impart to natural history. Kellogg's taxonomy, works particularly well in evaluating the central principles of Darwinism. His auxiliaries, too, aid selection by the addition of other principles that do not challenge or diminish selection, or by expansion of selection to other levels. But his alternative theories confute specific maxims of the minimal commitments for Darwinian logic. Kelloggian alternatives all denied the fundamental postulate of creativity for Darwin's principle of natural selection by designating other causes as originators of evolutionary novelties, or by relegating selection to a diminished status as a negative force. Each alternative rejects a necessary Darwinian postulate about the nature of variation, for example. Lamarckism and orthogenesis both deny the principle of undirected variability. Saltationism, the third alternative, refutes the claims that variation must be small in extent. Kellogg also recognized that modern versions might be seen as auxiliary, not consonant to be sure, but supplementary rather than substitutional. Thus, for example, if acquired characters are inherited only rarely and weakly, then Lamarckism might aid natural selection in developing an adaptation more quickly by secondary reinforcement, a position advocated by Darwin, oddly, himself throughout the origin. But if acquired characters are inherited faithfully all the time, then natural selection will be overwhelmed and Lamarckism becomes a refutation of Darwinism. Relative frequency, then, determines the distinction. Kellogg writes further, few biologists would hold any of these theories to be exclusively alternative with natural selection. They would restrict natural selection but little in its large and effective control or determination of the general course of descent. Kellogg treated the concept of natural selection with great respect, noting its internal coherency. Kellogg also recognizes and praises the battle that Darwin had with himself, as recorded in his numerous notebooks, which in truth was one of the greatest mental struggles of hominid history, hominid, human-like. With Darwin proposing and rejecting numerous theories along his gradual and almost painful journey by inches toward the theory of natural selection. That theory, when fully formulated in the 1850s, emerged as an intricately devised amalgam of logically connected parts, each with a necessary function, and not as a simple message from nature. We must treat Darwin's theory of natural selection, as Kellogg does, with respect for its internal integrity. I almost said eternal, but that would be apropos as well. Its internal integrity, even though both Gould and I desired to both expand and enrich the principles laid forth by Darwin's theory for the 21st century context. Now, in the 21st century, however, forms of these critiques are being advanced in different and helpful ways within Kellogg's auxiliary mode. That is, as ideas to expand while substantially changing the Darwinian core. For the first leg of agency, for example, the hierarchical theory of multi-level selection retains Darwin's emphasis on the centrality of selection as a mechanism, but rejects the notion that the organismal level must hold nearly exclusive sway as a causal locus of change and pattern. Indeed, on the first leg, the theory of hierarchical selection differs substantially from classical Darwinism in its basic logic and concept. For explanations of both stability and change must now be framed as compound results of a balanced interaction of levels, working in concert with one another, in conflict or orthogonally, and not as shifting optimalities built at a single level. On the second leg of efficacy, modern ideas of constraint and channeling deny the crucial isotropy of variation, so necessary to the logic of selection as the primal directional force in evolution, and therefore envisions important roles for structural and internal causes as patterning agents of evolutionary change. These internal channels work with selection as conduits for its impetus, that is, auxiliary, not alternative, in Kelloggian terms. Further, on the second leg, an emphasis on constraints and channels implies a new set of operational concerns and a revamping of the evolutionary research program. Internally imposed biases upon directions of change become a major field for study, have become, I should say, and the role of developmental patterns are again becoming prominent in evolutionary theory. For the third leg of extrapolationism, current notions of mass extinctions do not challenge the Darwinian mechanism per se, but suggest that any full explanation of macroevolutionary pattern must integrate the accumulated Darwinian effects of normal times with the profound restrictions and restructuring of diversity that occur in the environmental episodes too rapid or too intense for adaptive responses by many species and clades. On the third leg, moreover, a renewed application for the shaping power of mass extinction reinstates paleontology as a source of theory and not merely a repository for the historical unfolding of processes fully illuminated by macroevolutionary rules. The new theory of Darwinism forming in this contemporary era may remain Darwinian in core, but it's going to become a higher Darwinism, quoted to T.H. Huxley, but that was in the 19th century. But anyway, in contemporary versions of the three critiques, classical Darwinism either becomes expanded or dynamically changed with other causal forces working in concert with selection to produce the pattern and pageant of life's history, either at the conventional macroevolutionary scale or as interacting regimes through geological time, that is, like through mass extinction. Gould contends that the synthesis that is to emerge, and in fact now is even emerging, will build a distinct theoretical architecture, offering renewed veracity to Darwin's original vision, and a powerful reconstitution, and reconstruction, and the power of persistent critiques, awaiting the next antithesis that will lead us onward to the next of many future syntheses, the wondrous eternal play of evolution. Skipping down. The three principles that elevated natural selection from the guts of a working machine to a radical explanation of the mechanism of life's history can be best exemplified, according to Gould, again, as agency, efficacy, and scope. Regarding efficacy, Gould avers that almost any reasonably honest and intelligent biologist could easily understand that Darwin had identified a vera causa in natural selection. That's a true cause. Yeah. Thus, the debate in his time, and to a lesser degree, in our own as well, never centered upon the existence of natural selection as such. Rather, virtually all anti-Darwinian biologists accepted the reality and action of natural selection, but branded Darwin's force as a minor and negative mechanism instead, not the all mocked that Darwin and Darwinian theory tradition would later assert. Regarding scope, Gould stipulates that even the most favorably minded of the contemporaries often admitted that Darwin had developed a theory capable of building up small changes within a basic type. The equivalent, for example, of making domesticated dogs from wild wolves. They acceded that fully. Darwin, though, insisted upon a full sufficiency in extrapolation, arguing that his microevolutionary mechanism extended through the immensity of time, geologically speaking, would be fully capable of generating the entire pageant of life's history, both in anatomical complexity and taxonomic diversity, and that no other principles would be required at all. Gould disputes that very vehemently, and he does so through an image. It's very cool. Do all of us know what corals look like? Yeah. Okay. Right. Well, corals are not like a book, or not like a tree. In other words, they don't grow up and then you got various points that follow taxes off each side, right? Follow taxes all the way up, right? Spinning spiral all the way up. They don't have that. Corals just go virtually everywhere, from a firm base. They go up, and then they branch off, and they branch off again, branch off again, branch off again, branch off again. But that base, Gould likes to stipulate, is important for the coral. Indeed, because it greatly captures the imagery that he wishes to convey. One can cut up a coral, and it will still survive, to thrive and expand in new environments. However, one can never sever the main trunk, or the coral dies. Similarly, Gould cuts the strict Darwinian model that arose as the modern synthesis hardened in the 1950s. And he asserts that these cuts will not kill the coral or remove the essentialities of Darwinism from it. He's here modeling, or he's here using the metaphorical language of coral to be applied to Darwinian theory. I don't think I made that very clear. I'm sorry.
No, you did.
Okay. Well, I'm tired today, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry, but
So am I. But it's okay. You're doing fabulously well. Keep going.
Very well. Gould settled for an image of coral. Indeed, Gould designates 3 levels of potential cuts or excisions to this organic coral of the structure of evolutionary theory, as originally formulated by Darwin in The Origin of Species, and as revised by Hugh Falconer in recent decades. Right. The most inclusive and fundamental cuts are Gould entitles K cuts, for killing cuts. Those cuts, if you see the image of a coral like this, that would be like the cuts down here at the base of the coral. Those are killing cuts. However, those are K cuts, you could say. The first order branches are so fundamental that any severing of a complete branch converts the theory into something essentially different and it must be newly named. Similarly, in the same way that it kills the coral, it kills the theory, you could say. So those cuts can't be drastic. In other words,
Wait.
Can't be. Yes, sir.
Somebody's popping into my room.
Don, you just muted yourself.
Someone was popping into my room and wanted to talk to me, and I had it not muted, so I'm muting it so they can talk to me. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem.
Go ahead.
The K cuts are the killing cuts. Those occur to the bottom of the structure, of course, right? The first order branches are so important and fundamental that if you cut them, it kills the coral and kills the theory. However, the second level of R cuts, revision cuts, removes enough of the original form on one of the 3 branches to ensure that the new and stronger or more arborescent branch, in growing from the cut, will build a theory with intact Darwinian foundation, but with the general form sufficiently expanded, revised, or reconstructed to present an interestingly different structure of general explanation. That is the Falconerian. There we go. Falconerian model. Duomo of Milan.
I think it's Falconarian.
Falconarian, gotcha.
That's easier to say too.
Falconarian, you're right.
Mhm.
A third level of S cuts are entitled subsidiary cuts, and they only affect a sub branch of one of the major branches of the coral, and therefore reformulates the general theory in interesting ways while leaving the basic structure of the explanation intact. Gould wrote the structure because he believes that all three pillars, branches, or tripod legs, representing agency, efficacy, and scope, have all been subjected to fascinating R cuts, that is, revisionary cuts, on the second level, if you will, that requires us to develop a revised structure of evolutionary explanation, working toward the construction of a richer and fascinatingly different theory with a retained Darwinian core, rooted in the principles of natural selection. In short, late modernity is in the midst of a Falconarian,
Falconarian.
Falconarian, thank you, Falconarian, right, remodeling of a growing and multiform, yet coherently grounded intellectual edifice known as Darwinism. So then, contemporary challenges to all three central commitments of Darwinism, the legs of his tripod, or the essence, according to Gould, of evolutionary theory, prompted Gould to write this book. Indeed, even during the period of current orthodoxy, beginning with the coalescence and spread of the modern synthesis in the 1960s, the three supports or legs, the efficacy, agency, and scope, had never been particularly firm or adequately defended. Gould displays throughout the structure that the logic of this pronounced expansion builds a theory fascinatingly different from, and not just a smooth extension of, Darwin's single-level mechanism of agency, that is, natural selection, which is Gould's reason for portraying the hierarchical model as a deeply interesting R cut rather than a more superficial S cut. On the second branch of efficacy, the R cuts, that is, revisionary cuts, accepts the validity of Darwin's argument for creativity by leaving the base of the branch intact, but then introduces a sufficient way to formalist thinking via renewed appreciation for the enormous importance of structural, historical, and developmental constraint in channeling, in the positive sense, the constriction of Bernoulli's principle, channeling and then increasing velocity and so forth like that, in a Bernoullian sense. That the pure functionalism of a strict Darwinian tradition and approach to adaptation no longer suffices to explain. The strict Darwinian explanation has thereby been greatly changed and enriched, but in no wise defeated. On the final branch of scope, the R cuts, that is, revisionary cuts, the least intrusive cuts of all, accepts the Darwinian contention that microevolutionary roles and principles can build in grand patterns by accumulation through geological immensity, but it rejects the argument that such extrapolations can render the panoply of phenomena in life's history, without adding more so explicitly macroevolutionary modes for distinctive expression of these processes at higher tiers of time. Also, this particular R cut indicates the necessity of titrating adaptive microevolutionary accumulation with occasional resetting of rules and patterns by catastrophically triggered mass extinctions at time's highest tier. In sum, and I'm closing here, Gould wrote the structure primarily to discuss a critique and revision of strict Darwinism, which is but one reason why I have chosen to explore and expand question mark Gould's viewpoints massively in this dissertation. I'd like to offer an apology here quickly. This is a document that didn't flow as well as I thought it would on my first survey of it, but nevertheless, I left a lot of stuff out and I chopped it up and rearranged some sentences and even didn't delete everything. You saw that broken sentence earlier, right? And I apologize for that, but I just didn't have the time to clean this up prior to presenting it. So please forgive me.
I think it's totally fine. I noticed what you're talking about. Like there was a difference in this paper from other things you've presented to us, but you had already explained to me that you condensed it from like 65 pages, and that's very hard to do. And I would say that the only challenge for me was that when you read what you're writing, you sort of like have ideas as you're reading it that make you want to like rewrite it. You're rewriting it verbally as you're reading it. So sometimes you skip over things that you wrote and you put in other words, and occasionally that made me lose my place, and I had to do a quick search for the next set of words you were saying. But I'm not complaining about that. I didn't have any problem doing it. That's how I listen to almost everybody's paper. I just listen for a particular couple of words and I type it in the search and I get it back right away. So I honestly did not find that overly distracting, nor did it take away from my absorption of your paper. I just want to say that too.
Thank you.
So let me turn this over to Andrew for just a minute. I need to be gone for about 3 minutes, and I'll be right back. And you guys start giving Brad some feedback. I have a lot of feedback for you, Brad.
Okay. Dr. Bridges.
Oh, yeah, no, I had to actually just first before I had a few questions, but one was just more a question of clarification. That last sentence that you read in the second to last, actually the last full paragraph on the final branch of the scope. I was wondering, after the R cuts, I was wondering if you could just maybe explain that sentence a bit more, particularly how what the microevolution can't do in relation to the microevolution, or what they're that was a bit
okay.
That sentence seemed to involve a lot. If you could just maybe
Right, I should probably cut that sentence up. You're right. I probably should. Let's see on the final branch, because that's essentially, that goes back to Robin's point there. I write with complex sentences, and I do that because I'm just flowing with it, what have you. But speaking it, it's often hard to keep up, what have you. But right, on the final branch of scope, the R cut accepts the Darwinian contention that microevolutionary modes and principles can build. See, that right there is something that I wanted to ask y'all about. At various places in this paper, and more specifically in my dissertation, I do. If you look there at microevolution, if you put a parenthesis there before the M, go to the O of micro, put a dash, and then put a closed parenthesis there. Y'all may have seen that before in the paper. That separates the micro or macro from evolutionary, and that causes me to look at it closer. Is that an effective device at all, or no?
it's helpful. Yeah.
Is it? Okay. On the final branch of scope, the R cut accepts the Darwinian contention that microevolutionary modes and principles can build grand patterns by accumulation through geological immensity. However, this final branch of scope rejects the argument that such extrapolations can render the panoply of phenomena in life's history without adding explicitly macroevolutionary modes for distinctive expression of these processes at higher tiers of time. Okay, right.
Yeah.
So what?
And I guess my question is, what would those modes be? Like, what did you have in mind there? I know I was missing something there.
Yeah. Macroevolutionary modes, such as, for example, saltation. I don't like the terminology of saltation, but punctuated equilibrium would be a macroevolutionary mode of change. You know that often gets labeled as saltations, but it's really not. But um, punctuated equilibrium would be, let's see, other modes of thought, other macroevolutionary modes. The acceptation process would be a macroevolutionary mode that would be added there. Yes, sir, it would be.
Okay,
Right.
so, yeah. So maybe let me, if I've just understood the term, so they're saying microevolutionary modes can explain the, so for panoply, like the whole grand scheme of everything without resorting to such theories as punctuated equilibrium to provide explanation for the gaps.
Yeah.
Okay,
Right.
okay.
Right. I mean that's what when traditional neo-Darwinians and even ultra-Darwinians, if you want to get into Dawkins, ultra-Darwinism. I mean, I hate using all those qualifiers there because it gets confusing. But Darwin calls himself an ultra-Darwinian and not merely a neo. But regardless, for those types of people, microevolution, when you extrapolate it out to a geological time scale, is fully capable of doing the requisite work, if you will, to generate species.
Okay.
Okay, whereas other thinkers, Gould and myself included, and so forth like that, we think that macroevolutionary explanations must come to play in order to advance the micro. We don't dismiss microevolution. We don't dismiss it at all, but we do dismiss the idea that microevolution, in and of itself, extrapolated over eons of time, is capable of deriving the complexity that we see, for example, in the human brain.
Okay.
Right. Does that make better sense, Dr. Bridges?
Yeah, no, that clarifies it. No, I think you're. It's not that you wrote it. I just was having trouble putting it all together. But
Okay.
yeah, the sentence does say that. So yeah.
Okay. Very well. John Marger.
Hey, Bradford. Um, so I have a few questions too, but part of this question, my question is it's more of a statement and then a question. It would be helpful to see, is this the introduction to your whole dissertation, or what part does this specific chapter play in your
That's the
dissertation?
first chapter of the dissertation. The first chapter, yes, sir. Right. If I'm working, I have sort of retailored my dissertation because although it passed, I just simply realized it's just too daggone much to do in 225, 250 pages. It's just too much to do. So Phil and I conversed about it, and I said, well, I'm going to cut out a few things. So now I've only got 4 chapters plus a conclusion of my dissertation. Right. In so much as well, actually, 4 chapters, a conclusion and an introduction. Right. It's only 6 chapters. Right. In my dissertation, but the introduction I've not written yet. It's always wise when you're writing like this, when you're writing anything really, to put off the introduction to last when you've already got the finished product.
Okay, so this is your first chapter.
Yeah.
But in a way, this, as a first chapter, it's still introducing your topic.
Yeah.
So obviously the topic is evolution,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? That's the topic of your dissertation in some form.
Sure. Sure.
And then what are you trying to do? Are you trying, so what's your objective with the dissertation itself? What are you doing with evolution? What are you trying to show?
I think I've already presented on this a few times in the
I
past.
know, but
Like every single time you've ever presented.
Uh,
I need my mind refreshed,
uh,
because what it does is it helps me see what part this chapter is playing in the total whole, and whether it's successful for the overall objective.
okay.
Am I making sense?
Yeah, you are. I'm wanting to explore a contingentist understanding of divine action or divine involvement or even divine activity. I shy away from divine action because it's a losing game for theists. Because every time we posit a causal joint 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 15 years later, science collapses it and we're left worse off with the wise. Anyway, but I'm trying to develop a perspective on divine involvement, divine activity that is set, it could be considered in a in Thomistic terms, rather I should say, as a secondary form of causality, right? But I'm using Gould to emphasize the contingency, or what I label contingentist nature of all of reality. And I'm using Arthur Peacock later in I think that's chapter 4. So that's chapter 3, excuse me. Yeah, I'm using Arthur Peacock in order to display also the chanciness of evolution. And I'm using Thomas J. Ord in order to wrap all those threads together, in so much as in claiming that evolution is a process ultimately manifesting rather the notion of love, the love of God.
Okay. So therefore evolution has purpose. Is that true for you? Evolution has a purpose. God has a purpose, and he's using evolution to manifest the love of God. Uh, and if so, that doesn't seem contingent altogether. It seems like God is behind the process.
No, no, not at all. I want to argue that God may lay out general goals. I'm Persian in this regard. God will lay out like a goal of complexity with relationship with possibility of relationship with Him. He wants some entity, some creature. I don't like creature. I don't like animal because I prefer entity. But he wants some entity, some evolutionary entity that has enough complexity about them with which they may have a relationship with Him in one form or another. And on our earth, in this dispensation, in this, I guess, expansion before the next collapse, anyway, that's us humans. Now, like I said earlier, I adhere to a Persian perspective on teleology, on eschatology and so forth like that. That God has general goals, such as, like for example, the increasing complexity and so forth like that is my interpretation of Him. He wouldn't have spoke those words, but I do. And the derivation of entities with which you may have a relationship. Right. That's God's general goals. Now, the specificity of how those goals may be attained might be different in every dispensation. Probably are, because you're never going to do it. You're never going to have the same experience twice.
Okay. So, so I don't want to dominate the questions,
No,
but
no, go ahead.
it's bringing two sorts of questions to bear. One is on the relationship of God to this process, and then that's the macro perspective or the big perspective. And then I have questions on some of this terminology.
Let me answer the first one first, because I'll
Oh,
forget the second one. Okay.
all
The
right.
first one. How is God involved in this process? God is involved in this process, as I previously presented. You may not have been there. I'm not sure that God is canonically involved in this process, in that He, and I'm using the term He there just because of the limitations of our English language. He, she, whatever, imbibed themselves within nature, in the sense of nature absorbing, assimilating, taking up, you will, nature taking up the Godhead through the Spirit. Now, that means that the Spirit is intimately involved and intractably involved in every movement of the evolutionary of entities and evolutionary species in the world today, because God canonically entered into matter and infused matter with Himself through the personhood of the Spirit. So God is in the process from beginning to end. There's no spot where God is not, John.
Okay. Part of my questions that are unresolved in my mind, and you're touching on them, but they're still not answered, is it doesn't seem like God's, from your perspective, God is not in control, though. He's with, but not in control of the process itself.
You're wrong. I entirely affirm that.
And so the process is left to chance or indeterminism.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Again,
So if that's the case, then there's no way we know, there's no goal then, and we don't know what the end would be. We could end up with the human race destroying themselves, or a meteor hitting us, and etc., and creating a climate that's inhospitable to life.
well, that's invariably going to be the case.
I knew you were going to say that, right?
It's invariably going to be the case that, I mean, my word, if we live in an expanding universe, okay, right, and within our little solar system, we're constantly getting closer to the sun. I say constantly because it's hard to understand that, because this is over billions of years, but I'm trying to remember the exact time frame. 2.5, 2.6, 2.7 billion years from now, the sun's going to swallow us up as an Earth. We're going to become a ball of flames. Right? I mean, it's just going to happen. So that's the inevitable end of this Earth, this experiment, this evolutionary experiment upon Earth. We're going to be a ball of fire, literally.
If things go according to their current trend.
It's irreversible.
He's saying, he's not talking about global warming in the sense of our causing it in this moment. I don't think you are, Brad. You're saying we're headed towards the sun.
Exactly. We are expanding in space toward the sun. Okay. And the sun's is going to end up. I mean, we're inching closer to it every year. Not inching, but we're getting closer and closer to it every year, because the sun is expanding at such a rate higher than our velocity leaving from it out of orbit. Does that make sense to you, John?
Yeah, I'm understanding what you're saying.
So
Um,
then, so then, if that, then we have no, there's no reason for that trend not to continue.
if that continues, you're saying then we'll be baked.
Right. Well, I mean, we would actually just melt because the sun would be so hot that everything on Earth would melt and it would become another. It would become a whole goo of molten lava again, like it is in the core of the Earth right now. And of course, that would not be inhabitable for any of us.
Well, we'd die long before that happened.
Yeah, right. You're exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah, and we could die even sooner if we get hit by a big enough something from outer space. But all right.
Yeah.
I want to defer to the others, and then
Don't forget
I'll
about your
ask.
second question, okay?
Well, I'll ask my second
Okay.
question or questions.
Yeah.
But I want to see if Andrew or Robin want to,
Yeah. Just don't
go
forget about
first.
it, what I'm saying, because I want to answer it.
I,
Dr.
I
Bridges.
won't.
Yeah, and let me just kind of follow up with something that John kind of mentioned, and you gave an answer to, but I was wondering more with the experiential aspect of it for people who are religious. This idea that God has been imbibed or infused in all of nature, does that affect people's experience of the divine in nature in degrees or kind? I can use a trivial example or a meaningful one. Maybe I'll just use the trivial and then, but that kind of makes it seem silly. But then we could also think of a meaningful one too. If you see a potato chip, right? In one sense, we say, oh, God is infused in that. But then if you see one that looks like Jesus, you say, oh, well, God is really infused in that one, right? You don't like if is there a degree and what do we say to people who see higher degrees than others in different things?
It's interesting there. When I'm not I'm not claiming that God is a physical item. I'm not at all. That as if when I cut down a tree, I'm cutting down part of God. I mean, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that in metaphysical reasoning, that God thoroughly saturates all that is matter, and that He is moving the matter to higher stages of complexity. So I I don't think God is quantifiable, like a particle in atomic physics, or or even an element in chemistry. I don't. So I kind of question the premise of your question, Dr. Bridges.
I'll put it in a more meaningful way then. Like when Walt Whitman is sort of like walking through nature
Mhm.
and sort of feels as though he is experiencing God. Would that could we sort of say, oh, he's kind of coming to an awareness that you're sort of saying that God's sort of moving us toward a point,
Well,
and if another person just didn't feel that, they wouldn't be aware of that, or
well, I think that, I mean, and pardon my biblical quotation here, but or biblical allusion rather. The farmer is gonna farm, of course. He's gonna plant seeds, but only seeds on that farmland that's been tilled and prepared are gonna actually grow, right? In so much as our disposition toward God enables us to either receive from God or not to receive from God. In so much as two people can be looking at the very same thing and they can see God in the item, if you will, and the other not. one may see, another one may not. So our disposition toward the availability, or our disposition toward, I guess, the possibility and plausibility of God would impact our ability to see God within nature. Dr. Bridges, is that even remotely close to answering your question?
No, yeah, no, I guess you did answer. I guess the interesting term here is nature.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, yeah. I'm trying to ascertain the scope, given the metaphysical dimension that you're suggesting. Yeah.
I guess nature. I'm using the term nature to encompass all of the natural world. So maybe that helped you a little bit better there. But in so much as I think God permeates, infuses, and in fact is pervasive throughout the entirety of the natural world. And this fits in with Whitehead a little bit. Whitehead says there's always a lure of God toward himself, what have you, right? Well, I think that the basis, the fundamental reasoning for that lure of God is because God is in all things. In all things, all things come from God, all things are God, and all things are going back to God.
Is it my turn now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I have too much to, like John, so I'll just start and then I'll politely stop and maybe pick up with you later. So first I want to say, just listening to your discussion with Andrew and especially John, that I'm taken back to your last presentation when we did all that discussing about immanence versus transcendence.
Right.
And so of course, the way you are articulating it now, everything you just said to John and Andrew, you're describing what would be called theologically an immanence,
Yes.
a very, okay. Because remember, I asked you last time, well, okay, Brad, so, and it was very much a, I was taking the devil's advocate position when I said this to you. I think you knew that. I said, Brad, so explain to me why you're keeping transcendence, because it's all immanence, baby, most of the time in what you present, except for that last paper, it's all immanence. And the way you articulate your, how do I want to say it? Your theory, obviously, is what I mean. It's all immanence. It's like anybody. I think that might be, like what sort of like provoked John's questions, but I don't want to speak for him because anybody within the realm who's studied traditional theology and is interested in it, which is even you, as you admit, you're about to teach the fathers and you are interested in traditional theology. Anybody listening to you who has been saturated, who has imbibed traditional theology would say, oh my God, this guy is, he's just peddling immanence. He's doing it under the guise of evolutionary theory, warning, and unless you're an immanence, a very modern immanent, well, very modern, it's everybody these days. Unless you're an immanence theologian, and then you'll go, awesome, I totally buy into it. That's how I already saw it. Okay, so, but that's I don't have I am one of those people who, and I'm not bragging about this, I am one of those people who I'm always lured by God. So I always do see God in things. I call Walt Whitman, he's a nature mystic. Well, so was all those guys you like, Andrew. They're nature mystics, and they might not even call it God. Sometimes they do, but they just respond to the lure of God, you know, and I tend to do that too. And I have always seen God in your work. So I hope you don't mind my saying that, Brad.
No, 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 no.
Yeah, in a very powerful way. So, and I'm not threatened by the idea of you going way over into imminence, because um, that's why I invited you last time to just sort of say, yeah, Robin, you're right. I'm just gonna cut transcendence out of this thing. But you wouldn't do it, okay? And I want to remind you of that. So I don't really want to remind you of that. You already know. I'm telling John that, okay? So you wouldn't cut it out because I believe what you said to me. I do have it written down, and whatever notes I took last time, you said, that's a good question. I guess I'm hesitant to entirely remove to entirely get rid of that idea of God, the otherness of God. I think that's how you put it. Okay. So what I want to say, though, my notes on this part are way down in your paper. What I do is as I've said before, I copy whatever text you guys send, and then I make a new copy of it that says Robin on it, and I just kind of take notes as you read. And so I do have notes in red to you all the way through this paper. But since we're talking about theology right now, I just want to say generally that I love, is fascinated by your use of the word orthodoxy. And then after I noticed the way you were using it, which is very, well, of course, it's quite appropriate to use orthodoxy in any field nowadays. It's just become a word that is owned by, you know, it's become more familiar generally, but what it really means, if you go all the way back to the Greek, it means right belief, you know, orthodoxe, right belief. That is what it literally means. You can find that in Plato, and so that's exactly how you use it here. You know, like you mean traditional, you know, Darwinianism, and so I started noticing that you were using other metaphors. I would have to scroll down to there's another biological metaphor that you use in here, a biological term that I'll have to find after I finish talking, that you use in this metaphorical way, because you are using that word orthodoxy metaphorically, also whatever this biological term is. And so I really just want to say to you, you write in a very poetic way. And that's a high compliment from me, because I do believe that's like the highest level of creativity. When you see that in somebody's writing. And so I really see that, and it's strange. Of course, it's always been there in your writing, but for some reason, this thing you put together today it just hit me. And so I think that's awesome. All those terms you make up, those, you know, that's like the poetic impulse. And you come to a place where you talk very briefly about play here. And what you mean there is play like a Shakespeare play, play on a stage, right? But what I thought of immediately, because I'm sort of working on that word play, I thought of the way it was used by Kant and by Schiller, who was mostly a poet. He was a poet philosopher who came right after Kant. And then it was kind of taken, and other things happened in the German tradition. So the word is Spiel, and there's this thing that is attributed to Kant, but it's Schiller who uses the term first. Spieltrieb, that's Trieb, that's the play drive. The Kant talks about it in a very specific way in his third critique, but he's also kind of nervous about it because it doesn't, it colors outside of the lines of all of his moral theory and everything else. But he does note it as a legitimate drive in the human consciousness. And so I'm very interested in that. And I see that in what you're doing, that play thing. And to say a little bit more about it, I know I'm being terribly boring, but what I saw in this presentation, because you kept bringing it up here, then it's partly coming from your sources, but you're attracted to those sources. There's a narrativity going on to what you're talking about, and you don't use that word, but you mention it. It's like a story unfolding. And I find that very compelling. And so really for the first time, I thought, oh my God, maybe Brad is going to be the next Stephen Jay Gould. You know, I mean, and you're very good at being interviewed also as you're sitting there after you present, crunching on your snack, and we're asking you questions. You just really chill and you have all the answers. So you know this material very, very thoroughly. And there was something about the way you condensed it this time. It was very hardcore. A lot of the terminology was, what it reminded me of is one time a young scholar presented at one of Ingolf's conferences from Norway, and he was once one of Ingolf's students, and he has a hotshot position as a academic theologian in Norway now, and he wrote about Hegel, um, and the comment from the Hegelian that was at Ingolf's conference that year was that young man had written a paper that every sentence was a thesis statement. That's kind of what you were doing here, okay? You condensed your material and you have all these thesis statements. And I just want to say, I think that's amazing. You don't really owe your readers, nor do I think they need it, a fulsome explanation. You're very easy to follow even when you're using terminology.
Okay.
Last thing I want to say, though I might have more later if there's time and if other people say whatever they want to say. You mentioned the Just So stories, and you noted you still have to, I just want to say, I grew up listening to a recording of the Just So stories that my father would play for me to get me to go to sleep almost every night. And plus I'm an English major, so I know the Just So stories. And I'll just tell you briefly, and then you'll find it out when you research it more. Kipling's Just So stories, because Kipling lived in India for a long time, they are things like how the elephant got his trunk, how the rhinoceros got his skin. Okay, so they're kind of they're child-like stories that actually try to say, not in a realistic sense, just in a like fable kind of sense, how these animals came to look the strange way that they do. The elephant gets his trunk, you know, according to Kipling. This is obviously not true. He had a normal sized nose, and one day he was lured by a crocodile to come too near the river, and the crocodile wants to eat him, and he grabs his nose, and the elephant is heavier and stronger and pulls back, and it stretches his trunk out, okay? So they're all like that. There's one called how the cat who walked by himself. This made me think of Sugarloaf. The cat who walked by himself is about how cats are very independent, and this cat keeps being invited to come and hang out with other animals. And he says, no, for I am the cat who walks by himself. All places are alike to me. And then he stumbles upon a cave where a woman is keeping house and cooking a little stew, and there's a nice comfy couch and all this kind of stuff, and he can't resist it. So that that changes his whole MO, and he
Yeah.
can no longer be the cat who walks by himself, okay? Because he's lured. It's like the lure of God, okay? So I just want to tell you that your instinct to mention those, I think that fits very beautifully with what you're writing about, and you should investigate it, because I think I'm just speaking here as a writing teacher of many years. When you are writing about such dense biological material, well, evolutionary material, as you're writing about here, because I think this is the first thing you've ever presented to us that doesn't mention theology anywhere
Right.
or anything else. But interestingly, this narrativity thing kept creeping in. And when you're writing about dense stuff like that, if you do want to be the next Gould, you know, tossing in a little paragraph here and there with a little bit of that story kind of stuff,
Yeah.
that'll make people, they won't be able to put your book down. Okay.
Right.
Okay. That's all I have to say.
Thank you for that. I owe you a beer if I was a drinking man.
I thought we weren't doing that anymore. Are we doing iced tea instead?
I'm drinking lots of water.
Okay.
Yeah, my landlord's got my landlord's got a little water machine, you know what have you, that you put those 40-gallon jugs of water.
Yeah, those are good.
Right, and it's refilled, and he gets like 10 or 12 of them a week. I mean, that's all we drink right now.
That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Is that beer or water?
Water. I'll go out for a water with you anytime, Brad.
All right then, I like that.
I
Dr.
have one more
Bridges,
quick question if
yeah,
you have the time. It's just it was
I'll
fascinating.
roll-
Oh, it was fascinating the sort of the conversation that got started with the eminence and transcendence. And I read a bit of Whitehead, and I was just sort of wondering. Let me see if I've understood you correctly. So God has fused in a metaphysical sense with matter, but there are certain what we might call general purposes, like more complexity that God would like to see. Where metaphysically do you find that desire for complexity exists, or if there is any type of general goal? Like would that exist transcendently, or am I thinking about that wrong?
see. Well, of course, I am in I admit this. I read this back in 20, and even as God and Contemporary Science before that, in like 2000 something. But it was written in the late 90s. But I followed my mentor, Philip Clayton, in asserting a theological dualism, in so much as there comes a point, and I can't define it, neither can he, and neither can no one. Honestly, I mean, that's what philosophy is all about. But there comes a point at which you've got to make a division between God and not God. Okay, right? So there's a duality there, a sort of a lingering duality that I can't get away from. Again, because I do define the worlds and define the whole world into God and not God, right? So there's some sort of metaphysical reality outside of the system, if you will, that refers to God. But I look at the spirit of God as the effectual arm of God, and that He is the one that interacts. And again, I'm using He, but He is the one that interacts with people. He is the one that interacts with God. He's the mediator between God the Father and God the Son. If you want to take that look at it, what have you, right? He's all about mediation. He's all about interaction, all about relationship, all about relativity in the sense of relationships. So I take it that the Spirit, as the intermediary between God and man, as the intermediary between God and God, as the intermediary between, um, and I postulate that he's the intermediary between God and the world. And I'm right. I I posit that the Spirit is the one who does the imbibition, if you will.
Imbibition.
Yeah.
So you're saying
What's that?
the spirit cannot be the almost by virtue of its definition, the spirit cannot be
Ratio
made
temporally.
a purely transcendental idea. The whole
Right.
point of the spirit is non-transcendence. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's beautiful there. It is indeed, yes. I think that very, very, very well. Yes, I think that very well encapsulates what I want to say. What was your question, John?
All right, I'm going to go. Before I ask that other set of questions, I'm going to go back to something that Andrew just said, back to the macro perspective or the large scale. What's God up to in this? Because I thought I heard you say a while ago, maybe 20 minutes, that um, all come back to God.
Okay.
Is that a true statement? All come back to God,
I
and
all come back to God. What are you speaking of in like salvific terms or?
well, that's why I'm asking for clarification, because on the one hand, you're asserting indeterminacy,
Mhm.
and it seems like that's a very determinate statement to say that all go back to God.
That is a very
And that's
that,
why I'm
that's a
asking
very
for clarification.
that's awesome. I mean that could be that could be seen as such. You're right,
For
but again,
what
in
you're
my
saying exactly.
in my theological my theological duality, however, I think that ultimately all things do derive from God, exist within God, and then shall return to God fully in that sense. In so much as we came from God, because without God there'd be no principle of order, and that's what I mean by the coming from God. That God, if you will, gave a principle of order, of form, in the sense, and then evolution just bushified off of that, right? I made that word up, so please don't quote it. But
It's like this. It's like the corals.
exactly, beautiful, beautiful, right? It goes everywhere, right? Exactly, it goes everywhere. Has no real phyllotaxis to it, to use the expression from botany and about trees and so forth, right? But yeah, and then ultimately, I think that the destiny of man and women, right? The destiny of man is to be with God fully and not in a partial sense. Not in a partial sense like having the Holy Spirit abide within you, all that mess like that, right? But or to have actually experienced Jesus of Nazareth, whom I faithfully faithfully claim to be an exhibition of God, but not God per se. We've covered that before in the past too. But anyway, all things came from God. All things exist within God, and all things shall return to God. Yes.
Okay. So um so this isn't going to my smaller questions. This is staying on this because it's trying to understand the relation of divine the divine to what we call the created. Um uh So, but what you're telling me is there is a telling us there is a teleology. There's a teleological principle. Um, God is the source. Everything comes from God and everything goes back to God in some sense, fully. And you use the term fully. So that means there is a direction and there is some type of causation.
The I mean, let me use this analogy for you here, sir. Um, have you ever heard of the drunkard's walk with relation to evolution? The drunkard's walk.
Um, just explain it. I may have heard it, but
Very
I
well. Well, let's set up a situation in which you've got a wall on the left side. You got a wall on the left side, and then you've got open space. Well, actually, I'm reverse now. But right, but this is my left. Right. But you got a wall on the left side. You got open spaces on the right side. You got a drainage ditch, you could say, in there, right a little ways into the open side. Now, the drunkard's walk of evolution indicates that sometimes this drunk entity, this drunk evolving entity, will bounce off the left side of the wall and go forward in time. As many times, if not more, they're going to bounce off into the Never Never Land and drop into the drainage ditch. And then that would be that be an explanation for example, why 97.88 something percent of all species ever living before are now died, or are now leave no remnant at all, because they failed the drunkard's walk. But those species that drunkardly walked forward and against that left wall, they advanced and they procreated and they've created progeny.
okay, I'm not getting that drunkard's walk. Um, uh, so I mean, explain it a little more in relation to your thesis or your overall.
Well, I let me draw this graphically here because we don't have a board anymore. Traditionally, traditionally, this is a tree and that's a bush. That's a bush there. This is, traditionally, that's what you see. That's what you see. Come on, Bradford. Where's it at now? Come on, baby doll. Yeah, can you see that at all? Can you see the little bush there?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's actually supposed to be a tree, right? It's actually supposed to be a tree, and the tree has its greatest diversity up here on the top, with all of its all of its branches, all of its limbs, all of its leaves and so forth. And then you've got the little trunk down here. That doesn't look very good at all. But Gould postulates that the inverse is true. You got all your diversity down here. Then you got all your diversity down at the bottom. Down at the bottom. And then going upward there, you've got individual branches that are drunkardly surviving and expanding and diversifying. But you have your maximum disparity, or your maximum, another word for diversity, there at the bottom of the tree.
In the root system?
In the root, so you can say in the root system, right? That's where the majority of the diversity is located at. Whereas traditional Orthodox Darwinism says that we're descended from a few forms, or even one, and then up the branch of the trees, we've got great big diversity there. The branches of the trees and so forth. Gould says, no, 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 no. We've got more diversity in the roots, if you will, use Robin's terminology there, than you do in the branches and in the limbs. Does that make sense to you, sir?
It makes, well, you're explaining it now, so it makes sense. But that's quite a difference of opinion. That's so alternate a view of evolution that it's
I actually
an,
presented on that one time before, I think.
That's a
well,
little bit like how you describe the coral. Is that right,
Yeah,
Brad?
you're right. You're right. You're right. You're
that's
right.
almost like an anti-evolutionary theory. Not that there's not something general we call evolution, but it's so different than traditional Darwinianism that it's
Um, like I said, it takes. And this goes back to something I just said earlier, about 20 minutes ago, I guess. It takes in response to Dr. Bridges, it takes. We don't refute microevolution, but we say it cannot extrapolate to everything macroevolutionarily speaking, because of the drunkard's walk, only a few of this basal maximal diversity. Basally, during the Cambrian explosion, that's when we were most diverse, I contend. During the Cambrian explosion, and then from that, limb here, limb here, limb there, they survive, and then from that limb, the coral, going everywhere, form. But the maximal diversity was in the initial event, not in the latter event. Evolution is a masterful puppet. It can make masterful things. It can make magisterial things, even, you could say, but it cannot create diversity.
And that is that's different from the way that we sort of learn evolution in elementary
Yeah.
school. We do think that it creates diversity, and one of your points is that that's not how you see it.
Right, exactly. I view evolution as a dwindling of the bush into a number of I mean, because let's face it, guys and gals, right now we've got five body plans on this earth. Five. That disparity there is not very maximal.
What's a body plan?
Well, you could say it something like the ape-like body plan, if you will. You've got four arms, um, two arms, two legs, and you've got the not so hunchback. That's a body plan. Then you've got your walking body plan, if you will, like dogs and cats. Then you've got your cylindrical body plan of like bacteria. And then you've got birds, and I can't think of the fifth one right now because I'm just not thinking very well. But
Fish?
fish. There we go. Fish. Thank you. Right. Fish. Right. But those are the five basic types of body plans, and that's all we've got. Gould contends that at the basal area of the Cambrian explosion, there were far more body plans, and hence far more diversity and disparity than there was out of the surviving lineages that popped up here and there popped up.
Wow, and we can't even imagine those body plans. It's kind of funny, but that's really interesting.
How,
Oh, sorry,
Actually,
Andrew.
Bridges.
so how would we look at that theologically, or I guess teleologically, given like I'm thinking about it in such a basic way. So correct, but was God happier back in the, you know what I mean? Like I'm just sort of my first thoughts thinking about it.
Right, I understand. Well, I'm thinking. I mean, of course, you got to understand that complexity was low back in the Cambrian explosion. I mean, it was low. Complexity was lower than it is now. again, we've taken these branches here, branches there, what have you, and we've refined, honed, and reformulated those small branches. But the maximal diversity was at the Cambrian explosion. Now you asked me about God being happy. Would he be more happy? Would he be more happy with Cambrian explosion diversity or the more minimal diversity we have now today? I'm thinking he would be happy, or with what we've got today, if only because we've got creatures that can interact with him.
Like you say.
Yeah, on a higher level, right? Does that make sense to you, Dr. Bridges?
I have something to say about theology too. Hold on. So I was glad that that's what Andrew brought up. Okay, this is a note I took to myself, for myself. Like when you start talking about your R cuts,
Yeah.
which was after the choral part of your paper. And so it's the paragraph that starts, however, the second level of R cuts, revision cuts, removes enough of the original form on one of the three central branches to ensure that the new and stronger or more arborescent branch, in regrowing from the cut, will build a theory with an intact Darwinian foundation, but with a general form sufficiently expanded, revised, or reconstructed to present an interestingly different structure of general explanation. So you talk about orthodoxy. I think you used the word twice in this paper. And so when you're talking about Darwinian foundation, could I say could we say that's synonymous with what you're calling
Yes.
orthodoxy? Okay.
Yes, sir.
So here's the note I wrote. I said, this is what modern theology does. Okay. Like if somebody just encountered this paper, this chapter of yours, without understanding your commitment to theology, they might have this thought, okay? Even though you never mentioned theology in here. This is exactly what modern theology does. This is its game. The question being, what can you leave out and still maintain, fidelity of some sort to this foundation, orthodoxy? Can you go back and just, so I ask, can you go back and distance yourself from earlier R cuts? And um, is this done in evolutionary theory, is my question for you. Does anybody go back and distance themselves from R cuts that came before their own work and try to go back to the origin? Because that's what we do in theology. That's what we did in the Reformation. We're like, down with all that stuff that Roman Catholicism did in the last 1500 years. We're going back to the basics because we got it right. And so I'm wondering if that happens in evolutionary theory at all.
Think about the origin. Are you speaking origin there as in the text, or the origin as in the principle?
Not origin as in the writer, origin as in the, but I mean, I'm not saying that anything about an evolutionary origin. I'm just saying it's more obvious in the game of theology than it is in evolutionary theory. But it's that trend of always looking for the most original thing, and supposedly that's the most right thing. And I don't think that's what you're saying, and I actually don't believe that's true about theology either. So, but I want to know what you say about that anyway.
Okay, right. Well, when actually the way the question I asked you earlier is very apropos, because the origin of species is also the origin of modern evolutionary theory.
Exactly.
Right? So, in fact, but people go back to Darwin, and just like in theology, they've got their presuppositions, and they read them exactly the way that they want to, right? And especially when you get in those notebooks, because most of those have not been transcribed fully yet.
Amazing.
Yeah, because you can't read the damn handwriting.
Yeah, wow.
You can't read the writing, right? Francis Darwin, the grandson of Charles, translated, I guess, transposed, or what was the word I'm looking at?
Transcribed.
Transcribed, thank you. most of them, but he left probably 16 books untranslated or untranscribed, I should say. Right. But yeah. So I mean, a lot of that has to do with his difficult handwriting and so forth. But so the people today, when we have disagreements about evolution, we do generally go back to the origin of species as the origin of the movement. Even though evolution has been a topic since way back in Anarxes and so forth like that, but at least the concept of evolutio has been, not the mechanism.
Yeah. Well, that's just, I think what hit me right there in the very center of your piece was, wow, that's what he's describing is what theology does.
Yeah.
And I called it a game, meaning that thing of play I was talking about earlier, because okay, what I note about theology, since I'm much newer to this field than you three are, is, and yet I've been exposed to so much in the last 6 years. Some theology, and I will admit to you, Brad, immanentist, or what we might call process type theology, is the worst offender of this, in my opinion. It's sort of like rootless. It's like, what do I need those roots for? I just, um, you know, I have this idea about how God is or God should be, and I'm just going to say it. And the way I first realized how often this happened was because I really came here wanting to work on Plato, even though I didn't know Greek yet. And I started noticing how many people write about Eros, and I'm not thinking of you here. I've encountered many Eros, contemporary Eros theologians, long before I met you, Brad, and I couldn't stand their writing because they clearly had never read Plato on Eros, and even before Plato, some of the pre-Socratic, or at least contemporary with Plato, some of the pre-Socratics write about Eros, and it just really bugged me that they didn't bother to educate themselves about the history of the term, and at least know about it. And then if they want to reject it squarely, that's fine. But so that's how I realized people just, I don't like that kind of theology that just says, I don't need to when that happened with poetry, and I shouldn't complain about it in theology as much as I do. It happened in poetry at some point around the 19th century, and it became freestyle poetry. It didn't have to follow any sonnet form or anything like that, and I do like that. But that's what I'm comparing theology to. It's theology that says, I don't have any need to relate to the basics of how my field got started. I don't need to subscribe to any kind of orthodoxy or foundation. I can just say whatever. And I like encountering theologians who are struggling with how they can do what you're describing here in that paragraph I read, to make our cuts, and but still be able to trace what they're doing legitimately back to that foundation. Yeah, I do believe that's what you're doing theologically in your larger project, which points back to your last presentation as well. And that's why I do keep
Running notes.
needling you about the immanence transcendence thing, because I did get you to admit last time that you couldn't quite relinquish transcendence. So, okay, I'll shut up now.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for that comment.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's time for me to go, but I'll save my questions for later because they can be asked at any point.
Yeah, Yeah, I think you're.
in his,
I think
in his
I
book.
I think the Bodleian closes in 17 minutes, John. So you better pack your books up and get on down those 4 flights of stairs.
That's right.
All right, bud. Take care, man.
Hey, but before I leave, I enjoyed our time out for dinner, and I hope we can manage it again. I know the pandemic situation is affecting things more now than it was.
Didn't our governor? I mean, I don't watch the news. So I don't know. But I heard from a friend that the governor called for a 3-week shutdown
Hmm.
of
That's correct. Yeah.
right. Yeah.
But there are some restaurants that are still doing dine in.
Uh,
Um, I mean, I
Legally,
looked.
uh,
I don't. I haven't tried to read about it. My landlady would know all of it, chapter and verse.
I will.
But some.
I don't think they're allowed to do dine in, but if you look online, some of them say dine in, but they're not. If you call, they'll say no, we're not. That wasn't taken down.
But some of
It's
them have changed since we went out. Like, let me think. I don't remember, but well, of course, Bardot no longer says dine in, but it did say dine in back when we went out that night. Okay, so I want to go back out too, but I will be honest with you guys. I made a decision right after Thanksgiving to stop going out, except for I do have to go to the grocery store and occasionally the post office. I'm not saying I'm gonna hold to that right up until I get a vaccine, but something happened in my head and I just realized that,
You guys want to keep recording? If we're just gonna.
I think we can stop now.
okay, you're right. Good
Okay.
idea. Hold on. Let me fix that.
Because it kind of got more into
But
general conversation.
all I'm saying is that I'm looking forward to going out